right, this is Heidi Klein, your Level Up coach, here with another one of our conversations with a coach. And today I am here with Pastor Tim Brown, who is a friend and a coach in the ELCA, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America. And I asked him here today, this happens to be, we're recording it on Shrove Tuesday, sometimes known as Fat Tuesday or Mardi Gras. We're getting the last celebrations in before Lent starts. And one of the things that I have really enjoyed about getting to know Tim and following him on social media in particular is the way that he uses poetry and accesses poetry as a spiritual practice. So, Pastor Tim, tell us a little bit about yourself and sort of what draws you to poetry.
Yeah, so thank you, Heidi. Appreciate being invited. And actually, as you can tell, I'm outside, and it is Carnival. I prefer Carnival. I think that's a fun name. It celebrates the whole season, and I'll be meeting a colleague for a socially distanced coffee a little bit later. But one of the things that draws me to poetry, and one of the reasons I'm outside enjoying life, is that poetry, to me, well, to use the language of Lori Lopez says that poetry is the language of the soul. And so poetry for me says things that regular prose isn't bold enough or isn't well equipped enough to say. It speaks deeper than what prose does. And so it reconnects me with so many things, including like nature or what it means to be human. Yeah, that's why I am a poet and use it in my spiritual practices. Oh, and there's some nature right there.
Well, so that's as somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience with poetry, what would you say to somebody who says, that's kind of appealing, but I don't know where to start, or I find poetry intimidating? And how would you encourage someone to start to access poetry, and then how to transition it into more of a spiritual practice?
Yeah. So one of the best things about poetry is that poetry is like a mystery and not like a problem. If you think of a problem, what's the purpose of a problem? A problem is something that needs to be solved, right? But when you think of a mystery, and I'm not talking about like Scooby-Doo, I'm talking about like the sacraments. Mysteries are meant to be held, and they're meant to be thought about and contemplated and not figured out. It's not a Rubik's Cube. Poetry is a mystery. It's not a Rubik's Cube. So I think people who find poetry intimidating do so because they think they're supposed to get it. And you can get poetry about as much as you can get a soul, right? Like that's not something that you get. It's something that you just have and you hold and you interact with. And in glimpses, it shows up in these beautiful moments. So the minute you let go of the idea that you have to get the point of poetry is the minute that you're starting to live into it and absorb it and allow it to breathe for you instead of you trying to force it to breathe, And I would say that the biggest obstacle to integrating poetry into your spiritual life is this idea that like you have to know what it means to understand how it will affect you. And I would say that it's the opposite. You have to let it affect you, and then you'll figure out what it means to you, what it means in that moment. Think of the Psalms, right? You read a Psalm and you're like, God, that means nothing to me right now. And then you'll be at a different point in your life and you'll read it again and you're like, oh, that's exactly what it feels like. The Psalms are poetry. It depends where you are and how you're interacting with the world to see how it shapes your life. So I think the way that you integrate poetry into your spiritual life is you just start using it. And I go to poets that focus most on nature, because if there's one thing that we all know, it's what it feels like to be in nature. So like Mary Oliver, is a wonderful poet. Rilke is a great poet who speaks to these ways and kind of incorporates spirituality. Even though Mary Oliver was an agnostic, I think her poetry is like supremely spiritual. Um, and then Nayyirah Waheed, who's one of my favorites, Nayyirah Waheed, she says that you walk into a poem and you walk out of it a different person. And if you integrate poetry into your spiritual reflections, like you do a Bible verse, like you do a psalm, you find yourself living into that reality. You walk out a different person. It means something different throughout the day. So, I mean, the best way to do it is like jumping in the water in the cold morning. You don't want to get in that pool because you know it's super cold. You just got to dive in. Use a poem. Don't try to figure it out. Let it envelop you, and then see where you go.
I love that. That sounds like a great way to start in a practice like that. Yeah, so in addition to reading poetry, you mentioned that you like to write poetry. Do you have any advice for somebody who's thinking they want to do a little writing around a practice related to poetry?
Yeah, so the biggest hurdle to writing poetry is giving up the burden of profundity. You don't have to be profound to write poetry. And this problem that people have with, oh, it's got to be imaginative and mean something. Poetry at its essence is just putting into words what your soul is feeling in the moment. So, like, one of my favorite poems of all time is, well, Nayyirah Waheed. She wrote this little one-line poem. It says, "Grieve so that you are free to feel something else." And on the page that she printed this, it's in her book Salt, which is wonderful. Um, on the page, that's all it says in the very middle of the page, and the rest is like this blank space around it. And you realize that there's no profundity necessary because that's all that needs to be said right there. That's what she was saying. That's what it means. Um, in all that blank space says volumes that she didn't have to put into words. So I would say that, you know, poetry, when you're starting out writing it, is about putting into as many or as few words as you feel is necessary what your soul is saying at the moment. Um, and then
I love
let the
that
blank space around it.
you recently shared that poem in your social media.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it stopped me in my tracks because I've been talking a lot about, we're taping this on Good Friday in 2021. We have had a year of immense grief because
The eve of
just the
Ash Wednesday.
losses, yeah, right, have
Right.
just stacked up, right, over this
Yeah.
last year. And
Yeah.
I love grief so that you can feel something else. Like, I think we all need to pause and grieve the losses of this year. And that poem, just like I said, it stopped me in my tracks. And so it may actually have been what spurred me to say, hey, Tim, we need to do one of these interviews.
Yeah.
um, yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
But, this
so
has been,
go ahead.
go ahead.
I was
Oh,
going to say,
well,
like,
go ahead.
in that, yeah, that was just my morning meditation that morning. So, like, I wake up and I have a couple different poetry books that I pull from, and I just pull it out, and sometimes and I just read whatever it is there, and sometimes I know what it means in the moment, like that one. I knew what it meant in the moment for me, and then some I just have to kind of sit and germinate on and figure out. Um, So when you find a poet that speaks to you, I would say just use them over and over again. And like the Psalms, you'll feel the divine speaking to you in these interesting ways. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, well, I love it. Like I said, that poem, that posting might have been what actually led me to say, before Lent starts, I want to make sure I get this interview with Pastor Tim done. So for those of you who have enjoyed this conversation, I can tell you that Pastor Tim is an artisan with words, and he has a blog at reluctantchristian.com. I'll post a link in the comments on this video so that you can follow him if that's something that you would like to do. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for taking the time And I do know that I invested in Mary Oliver's book called Devotions this year and intend to use them as part of my Lenten practice. So I will keep you
Yeah.
posted
Oh,
on what poetry as a spiritual practice looks like for me. This will be a new venture for me.
yeah, wonderful. Well, and Heidi, I just want to reiterate, like, when you're starting out with poetry, just find a poet that you love and stick with them. And if it doesn't, if it attracts you in the middle, it'll speak to you in the end. So keep at it and keep working it, and you will find that eventually you will live in the house of words, and it will impact your life in beautiful ways.
All right. That's wonderful advice. Thank you.